The lower levels of Korvek's station smelled like rust and regret, and Lyra had learned to call this place home for the past 3 years of her miserable existence. She pressed her thin body against the cold metal wall near Dock 7, watching the cantina doors with eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. And she waited like she did every single night, without fail. Lyra was Valanthe, though most days she wished she could forget that painful truth about herself. Her lavender skin had turned gray from malnutrition and grime, and the bioluminescent freckles that once sparkled like stars across her cheeks had gone completely dark many months ago. Her people had been royalty once upon a time, respected across the galaxy as artists and diplomats and empaths who could feel the emotions of others. But that was before the Dominion Wars destroyed everything she loved. Now the Valanthe were scattered refugees that nobody wanted, and Lyra was just another piece of war trash, waiting for scraps outside a dirty cantina on a dying space station. The door slid open and a group of Kreth traders stumbled out, their scales gleaming under the flickering lights as they laughed at some cruel joke. One of them spotted Lyra in the shadows, and his face twisted with disgust as he looked at her. "Fade blood," he spat at her, and his companions laughed even harder at the slur. Lyra did not react, because she had heard worse things said about her kind, and showing emotion only made them want to hurt her more than they already did. The Kreth tossed their food containers toward the recycling unit, but one of them missed and clattered to the ground near her feet. She did not move to grab it, even though her stomach screamed with hunger pains that never seemed to go away. She had learned to wait until they left, because reaching for food too quickly had earned her kicks and burns in the past from cruel aliens. The traders walked away still laughing, and only then did Lyra crawl forward to retrieve the container with trembling hands. There was maybe a quarter portion of some gray protein paste left inside, and she scraped it out with her fingers and licked them clean. It tasted like nothing, but it would keep her alive for another day, and that was all she could hope for anymore. She retreated to her sleeping spot in a ventilation shaft nearby, clutching the broken pendant that hung around her neck on a frayed cord. The pendant bore the crest of her family, and it was the only thing she had left of her mother, who had died protecting her during the evacuation. Her mother had been a keeper of songs, one of the highest honors among the Valanthe people, and Lyra had been training to follow in her footsteps before the bombs fell and destroyed their beautiful world. Now, she was nothing but a ghost that everyone wished would simply disappear. Forever. The next evening brought the same routine of hunger and waiting and shame that never ended. Lyra took her position near the cantina and watched the various species come and go without ever noticing her existence. Tall insectoid vrix clicked past her without a glance in her direction. Furry Malvani merchants argued over prices and ignored the starving girl completely. Blue-skinned Tarani diplomats walked by, discussing important matters, while she pressed herself smaller against the wall. Then a human walked out of the cantina, and everything changed forever. Lyra had seen humans before, but never paid them much attention, because they were considered primitive newcomers to the galactic community. This one was different somehow, though she could not explain why she felt that way. He was older, maybe 40 cycles by human standards, with gray streaking his dark hair and deep lines carved into his weathered face, clothes of a cargo hauler, and carried himself like someone who had seen combat and survived it. His name was Marcus Cole, though Lyra would not learn this until later. He paused outside the cantina, holding a container of half-eaten food, and his eyes scanned the corridor like he was looking for something specific. When his gaze found Lyra in the shadows, he did not look away with disgust or pretend he could not see her. He looked directly at her, and Lyra felt her heart pound with sudden fear. Most species who noticed her wanted to hurt her or use her or sell her to labor camps. and she prepared to run if she needed to escape. But the human did something she never expected in a million years. He walked toward her slowly, not threatening, and he held out the container to her like an offering of peace. "Didn't feel like finishing it," he said in a gruff voice that somehow sounded kind underneath the roughness. "Shame to waste good food when someone else could use it." Lyra stared at him with wide eyes that had forgotten how to trust anyone at all. No one had handed her anything in 3 years of surviving on this station. They threw food at her if they felt generous, or more often, they simply ignored her like she was invisible. But this human was offering the container directly to her hands, meeting her eyes like she was a real person deserving of basic respect. She reached out with shaking fingers and took the container from him. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice cracked from disuse because she rarely spoke to anyone anymore. The human nodded once and turned to walk away without asking for anything in return. Lyra watched him go, and something stirred in her chest that she had not felt in years. Before she could stop herself, words spilled from her lips in her native tongue. "Valshira en Corvette," she said, which was a phrase of formal gratitude that her people reserved only for honored guests and those who showed exceptional kindness. It meant something like, "Your light honors my shadow," and it was not spoken lightly among the Volanthi. The human paused and glanced back over his shoulder at her with a curious expression. He did not understand the words, but something made him look at her differently than before. And in that moment, Lyra's freckles flickered with the faintest glow of violet light for the first time in over a year. It lasted only a heartbeat before fading back to darkness, but it happened nonetheless. The human saw it, and his eyes widened slightly before he nodded again and walked away into the crowded corridor. Lyra stood there, holding the food container like it was made of precious gold. She did not understand why this small kindness affected her so deeply, but tears were streaming down her dirty face. She ate the food slowly, savoring every bite instead of gulping it down like an accident. Animal. The human had handed it to her like she mattered, and somehow that made it taste better than anything she had eaten in years. That night in her ventilation shaft, Lyra held her mother's pendant and thought about the strange human. She wondered if she would ever see him again, or if this was just a single moment of light in an endless darkness. She did not dare to hope for more, because hope had only ever led to pain and disappointment. But somewhere deep inside her heart, a tiny spark refused to die completely, and that spark would change everything in ways she could never have imagined possible. The human returned the next evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that one too. Lyra noticed the pattern within a week, and she did not know what to make of it at all. Every night, Marcus Cole would exit the cantina near Dock 7 with a container of half-eaten food, and every night he would find Lyra waiting in her usual spot. He never made a show of giving her the food or drew attention to what he was doing. He simply handed her the container with a nod and walked away to his ship without saying much. Sometimes he would say, "Evening," and sometimes he would say, "Good stuff tonight," but mostly he just let the action speak for itself. Lyra began to trust the pattern, even though trust was something she had forgotten how to feel. She started watching humans more closely during the days when she had nothing else to do. She observed them in the market areas, and the common spaces, and the repair bays where they worked on their ships. They were strange creatures who behaved nothing like the other species on the station. They touched each other constantly, in ways that confused her deeply. They shook hands when they met, and patted shoulders when they parted, and hugged when they were happy or sad. They laughed loudly at jokes that other species did not find funny at all. And strangest of all, they helped each other for no apparent reason that she could understand. A human mechanic fixed another human's ship for free just because they came from the same planet. A human trader shared information about good deals with a competitor simply because she asked nicely. This made no logical sense to Lyra, because among the Volanthi, everything was calculated and measured carefully. Every gift created a debt, and every kindness required repayment in some form eventually. But these humans seemed to give without expecting anything back. Weakness. Lyra was beginning to think the galaxy was wrong about many things. 3 weeks after their first meeting, everything almost fell apart completely. Lyra was scavenging near the lower cargo bays when 4 Kreth traders cornered her in a dead-end corridor. She recognized one of them as the alien who had called her Fadeblood outside the cantina. "Look what we found," the leader said, with a cruel smile stretching across his scaled face. A Volanthi all alone with no one to help her. Lyra pressed her back against the wall and tried to make herself as small as possible. "Volanthi females sell well at the labor camps," another Kreth said while pulling out a restraint device. "They're naturally docile and they can sense what the masters want before being told." "Please," Lyra whispered, with terror making her voice shake badly. "Please just let me go." "Why would we do that when we can make good money from selling you instead?" Leader laughed and reached for her arm. Then a voice cut through the corridor like a blade made of ice. "Step away from her right now." The Kreth turned to find Marcus Cole standing at the entrance of the corridor with his arms crossed over his chest. He was not holding a weapon, and he was outnumbered 4-1, but something in his eyes made the traders hesitate. "This is not your business, human," the leader snarled at him with annoyance. "Walk away before you get hurt." "She is my business," Marcus said in a flat tone that promised violence, "and I am not going anywhere without her." The Kreth exchanged uncertain glances with each other. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy that made predators think twice about attacking them. They called humans pack bonders, which meant if you hurt one human, then others would come seeking revenge. Worse than that, humans did not calculate their revenge logically or reasonably, acted on emotion, and they held grudges forever, and they never forgot those who wronged them. A single human was dangerous enough, but making an enemy of their entire species was something no one wanted. "Fine," the leader spat with anger twisting his face. "Keep your war trash, human. She is not worth the trouble anyway." The Kreth retreated past Marcus, and one of them deliberately shouldered him as they walked by. Marcus did not react, except to keep his cold eyes fixed on them until they disappeared around the corner. Then he turned to Lyra, with a softer expression on his face. "You okay?" he asked her gently. Lyra realized she was trembling violently, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. "Why?" she managed to ask through her tight throat. "Why did you help me when you could have been hurt?" Marcus shrugged like the answer was obvious to anyone with sense. "Didn't seem right not to," he said simply. Lyra stared at him. Tried to understand this strange logic that made no sense to her. "But I am nothing to you," she said, with confusion filling her voice. "I am just a refugee who eats your leftovers. You owe me nothing." "I don't help people because I owe them," Marcus said, while offering her his hand to help her stand. "I help them because it's the right thing to do." Lyra took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was warm and strong, and surprisingly gentle for hands that looked so rough. "Among my people," she said quietly while looking at the floor, "every kindness creates an obligation. I do not know how to repay you for this." "Then don't," Marcus said with a small smile softening his stern face. "That's not why I did it." They walked together toward the cantina in a silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Lyra found herself wanting to talk to this human who saw the world so differently from everyone else. "I was going to be a keeper of songs," she found herself saying without really meaning to. "My mother was training me before the war destroyed everything we had." She touched the broken pendant around her neck. This is all I have left of her now. It is worthless to anyone but me. Marcus looked at the pendant with interest in his eyes. What's a keeper of songs? He asked her. We preserve the history and emotions of our people through music, Lyra explained, while feeling a familiar ache in her heart. We sing the stories of the past so they are never forgotten. It was a position of great honor. Sounds like you were somebody important, Marcus said matter-of-factly. Lyra stopped walking and stared at him with shock, freezing her in place. No one had acknowledged her former status in 3 years of surviving on this station. To everyone else, she was just war trash, and fade blood, and a refugee worth less than garbage. But this human looked at her and saw something more than a starving girl covered in grime. He saw who she used to be, and maybe who she could become again, someday. Would you like to eat a real meal? Marcus asked, while gesturing toward the cantina. At a table like a proper person, instead of from scraps in the shadows? Lyra nodded, because words had completely failed her in that moment. They sat at a small table in the corner of the cantina, and Marcus ordered food for both of them. When it arrived, Lyra ate slowly and carefully, despite her screaming hunger. She used the proper etiquette her mother had taught her so many years ago. Marcus watched her with a curious expression on his weathered face. You eat like a princess, he observed quietly. Someone taught you that. Someone who wanted you to remember who you are. Lyra's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they were not from sadness alone. This human saw her in ways that no one else did. And that simple act of seeing changed everything inside her heart forever. Marcus found Lyra 3 days later in her usual spot near Dock 7 with an offer that terrified her completely. I need a co-pilot for a long-haul job, he said while leaning against the corridor wall. 6 months out to the Rim territories and back again. Lyra looked at him with confusion, clouding her violet eyes. Why are you telling me this? She asked carefully. Because I'm offering you the position, Marcus replied like it was the most normal thing in the galaxy. Room and board included, plus legal work registration, so nobody can hassle you anymore. Lyra felt the blood drain from her face as fear gripped her heart. I do not understand, she whispered, with her voice shaking badly. What do you want from me in return? She had learned through painful experience that offers always came with hidden costs. People did not help Valampy refugees without expecting something back, and those expectations were usually terrible things she did not want to think about. Marcus seemed to understand her fear, because his expression softened with something like sadness. No strings attached, Lyra, he said gently, while using her name for the first time. You want out at any point, then I drop you at the nearest port with no questions asked. But I think you're tired of just surviving each day. He paused and met her eyes directly with his steady gaze. I think you want to actually live again. Lyra stood there, trembling, with 1,000 thoughts racing through her terrified mind. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse, because safety came from staying invisible and expecting nothing from anyone. But something deeper whispered that this might be her only chance to escape the slow death she was living. Why me? She asked finally. You could hire anyone on this station to work on your ship. Maybe I could, Marcus admitted with a shrug. But none of them would be you, and I think you deserve a second chance, just like my ship. He gestured down the corridor toward the docking bay. Her name is the Second Chance. She's not pretty, but she flies true, just like someone else I know. Despite everything, Lyra felt her lips twitch towards something that might have been a smile. You are very strange for a human, she said quietly. I'll take that as a yes, Marcus replied, with a grin breaking through his usual stern expression. The ship was indeed not pretty, but Lyra thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The Second Chance was a battered cargo hauler with patches welded over old hull breaches and engines that wheezed during startup. But the interior was clean and well-maintained, and it smelled like coffee and engine oil instead of rust and despair. Marcus showed her around the small vessel with obvious pride in his voice. "Galley's here. Heads through that door. Cargo hold takes up most of the lower deck," explained while pointing at various compartments. Then he stopped outside a small cabin with a viewport built into the wall. "This one's yours," he said while opening the door. Lyra stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat painfully. The cabin was tiny, with just a bunk and a storage locker and a small desk bolted to the wall. But the viewport looked out at the stars, stretching endlessly into the black void of space. "I figured you'd want the view," Marcus said from behind her. "Something pretty to wake up to instead of metal walls." Lyra turned to face him, with tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "This is the only cabin with a viewport," she said with realization dawning in her mind. "Where do you sleep?" "I moved my stuff to the bunk by engineering," Marcus replied with another shrug. "It's fine. I like being close to the engines anyway." He had given her the best room on the ship, without hesitation or complaint. This simple kindness broke something inside Lyra that had been frozen solid for 3 years. She started crying, and could not stop no matter how hard she tried. Marcus stood there awkwardly for a moment, before stepping forward and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Hey now," he said softly. "It's just a room. Nothing to cry about." "You don't understand," Lyra sobbed, while covering her face with her hands. "No one has given me anything that cost them something in so long. I forgot what it feels like to matter." Marcus did not say anything, but he did not remove his hand either. He just stood there, being present while she cried out years of loneliness and fear. The first weeks on the ship were difficult for both of them. Lyra flinched at sudden noises, and hoarded food under her mattress, and slept with her back against the wall. Marcus never commented on her behavior, or made her feel ashamed about it. Extra rations, where she could find them, and gave her plenty of space to feel safe. He treated her like a proper crew member, with expectations and responsibilities. She learned to operate the navigation systems, and monitor cargo manifests, and run diagnostic checks on the engines. It felt good to be useful again, instead of just existing from one miserable day to the next. Slowly, carefully, Lyra began to trust that this was real. Human culture continued to amaze and confuse her in equal measure. Marcus sang terribly while cooking their meals, and seemed to enjoy the awful sounds he made. He talked to the ship's coffee maker like it was a person, and had named it Old Reliable. He told her stories about Earth, a planet of impossible variety, where humans lived in deserts and ice fields, and jungles, and floating cities on the ocean. "We adapted to everything the universe threw at us," Marcus explained one evening over dinner. "Humans are too stubborn to know when we should just give up." Lyra listened to these stories with growing wonder in her heart. Her people had been elegant and refined and civilized for thousands of years before the war. They had built their society on careful logic and measured responses and calculated kindness. But these humans were chaos and emotion and fierce loyalty that made no logical sense, and yet somehow they thrived across the galaxy, despite being considered primitive newcomers. As the weeks passed, Lyra noticed changes happening inside herself. Her appetite returned, and her body began to fill out from proper nutrition. The gray pallor faded from her lavender skin, and her freckles started glowing faintly again. Most importantly, her empathic abilities slowly awakened from their long dormant state. She began to sense Marcus's emotions bleeding through his gruff exterior. There was loneliness underneath his self-sufficient attitude, old grief that he carried like heavy chains. There was fierce protectiveness whenever danger approached, and quiet pride whenever she learned something new. She realized that Marcus Cole was just as broken as she was, in his own different way. They were two damaged people on a ship called Second Chance, and maybe that was exactly what both of them needed. One day, a message came through from Korvek Station, announcing a refugee audit. All unregistered aliens without proper sponsors would be detained and processed for deportation. Lyra read the message and felt cold terror spreading through her entire body. She had no papers, no legal standing, and no way to prove she had a right to exist anywhere. Marcus found her staring at the screen with tears streaming down her face. He read the message once, and his expression went hard like stone. "I'll file the paperwork to register you as permanent crew," he said without hesitation. "Will be enormous," Lyra protested weakly. "The system is designed to discourage exactly this kind of thing." "Then I'll pay the enormous fees," Marcus replied while already pulling up the registration forms. He liquidated his savings account that afternoon without even pausing to consider the cost. When the authority officer came to verify the registration, he sneered at Lyra with obvious disgust. "A Volanthi," he said with contempt dripping from every word. "You're wasting good money on war trash human." Marcus stepped forward, and his eyes went cold like death itself. "That war trash is my crew," he said in a voice that promised violence. "That makes her my responsibility. You got a problem with my crew, then you got a problem with me." The officer backed down immediately and approved the registration without further comment. Lyra stood behind Marcus, feeling something she had not felt since childhood. For the first time in years, someone was willing to fight for her. She finally felt protected, and that changed everything. 6 months turned into a year, and then 2 years passed without either of them noticing. The second chance became home in ways that neither Marcus nor Lyra had expected. They fell into a comfortable rhythm of work and rest and quiet companionship. Lyra proved herself invaluable as more than just a co-pilot on their many journeys. Her empathic abilities helped Marcus read difficult clients and sense hidden dangers. She could tell when a trader was lying about their cargo or when a deal was about to go bad. Her natural grace returned as her body healed from years of starvation and neglect. She moved through the ship like a dancer and spoke with quiet authority that surprised even herself. Most remarkably, she began composing music again for the first time since the war. Late at night, when Marcus was sleeping, she would sit by her viewport and sing softly to the stars. The songs were haunting Volanthi melodies that carried centuries of history and emotion. One evening Marcus woke and heard her singing, and stood silently in the corridor listening. When she finished, he did not say anything, but his eyes were wet with tears he refused to shed. Word spread through the trading networks about Marcus and his unusual crew member. A human and a Volanthi working together was strange enough to attract attention everywhere. People called them the primitive and the extinct, with cruel humor behind the words. But other Volanthi refugees began seeking them out at ports and stations across the sector. They came desperate for news of their scattered people and hoping to find others who survived. Lyra spoke with each of them and shared what little she knew about other survivors. She became a quiet beacon of hope for her dying species, without really meaning to. Her existence proved that survival was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. One night, after a particularly emotional meeting with a young Volanthi orphan, Lyra asked Marcus something she had wondered about for years. "Why did you help me that first night on Korvek Station?" she asked, while they sat together in the galley. "You could have walked past me like everyone else did." Marcus was quiet for a long moment while staring at his coffee cup. "I owe your people a debt I can never repay," he said finally, with his voice rough. Lyra felt the weight of old grief and guilt radiating from him like heat from a dying star. "Tell me," she said softly. Marcus took a deep breath and began speaking words he had never shared with anyone. 15 years ago, I was a soldier in Earth's Colonial Defense Force," he said slowly. "We were on a first contact mission near the border territories when everything went wrong." He paused, and his hands trembled slightly around his cup. Our sensors picked up a ship approaching fast, and command identified it as hostile. We opened fire before they could reach weapon range. His voice cracked and he had to stop speaking for a moment. It wasn't a warship, Lyra. It was a refugee transport carrying Volanthi families fleeing the Dominion advance. Lyra felt the horror of his memories wash over her. Through her empathic senses, she saw flashes of burning wreckage and floating bodies and children's toys drifting through the void. 312 people died because we made a mistake. Marcus continued with tears finally falling down his weathered face. Including 67 children who never got a chance to grow up. Marcus, Lyra whispered with her own eyes filling with tears. I've carried that weight every day since then, he said while meeting her gaze. I left the military and bought this ship and tried to forget what I did, but you can't forget something like that. He reached out and gently touched the pendant around her neck. Saw you on that station, starving and alone and still carrying yourself with dignity. I knew I had to do something. His voice steadied with fierce conviction. I can't undo what happened or bring back the people my unit killed, but maybe I can help one person that my species hurt. Maybe I can prove that humans are capable of more than just destruction. Lyra took his hands in hers and held them gently. Among her people, this was a gesture of profound trust, reserved only for family and the closest bonds. You carry death inside you, she said, while sensing the full depth of his pain. But every day you choose life instead. You choose kindness instead of despair, and hope instead of surrender. She squeezed his hands tighter. That is not weakness, Marcus. That is the greatest strength I have ever witnessed. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Cole allowed himself to weep for the lives he had taken. Lyra held him through the storm of grief and did not let go until he was ready. Everything changed 3 months later when they arrived at Nexus Station for a routine supply run. A Volanthi warlord named Torvox had come to attend a major trade summit. He was one of the commanders who had sided with the Dominion during the war. His forces had conquered Lyra's homeworld and scattered her people across the galaxy. Lyra recognized him the moment she saw his face on the station's news broadcast. Fear and hatred warred inside her heart as memories of fire and screaming flooded back. But something worse happened when Torvox spotted her in the crowded market square. His eyes locked onto the pendant around her neck, and recognition dawned on his cruel face. The daughter of the High Keeper, he said, with cold satisfaction. I thought your bloodline was extinct. Lyra tried to run, but his guards were faster and stronger. They grabbed her before Marcus could react. Her into a side corridor. Marcus fought like a demon possessed, but there were too many of them. They beat him down and left him bleeding on the floor, while they carried Lyra away. She screamed his name until someone pressed a sedation patch against her neck. The last thing she saw was Marcus struggling to rise with blood streaming down his face. When Marcus finally regained consciousness, he found his ship ransacked and Lyra gone. Rage and fear burned through him, like wildfire consuming dry brush. He activated the emergency communication beacon that all human vessels carried for emergencies. Then he started making calls to every human he knew in the sector. Within hours, a network had formed across a dozen systems. Human traders shared information about Torvax's ship movements through encrypted channels. Human mechanics at various stations tracked fuel purchases and supply requisitions, conversations, and passed along rumors. A retired military captain named Sarah Chen answered his call and offered her old warship. She's not much anymore, but she still has teeth, Sarah said grimly. Give me a target, and I'll bring the fight. More humans responded to the call, despite the danger involved. Freighter captains and mining crews and cargo haulers all offered whatever help they could. Some of them had never even met Marcus, but they came anyway, because that was what humans did when one of their own needed help. Torvax received reports about the human mobilization and could not understand what was happening. Why do they care about one Volanthi female? he asked his advisors with confusion. She is nothing to them. His intelligence officer reviewed the data with growing unease. The humans have a concept called pack bonding, he explained nervously. When they form emotional attachments, they become irrational and extremely. She is crew on a human vessel, another advisor added. In human culture, that makes her family. Torvax dismissed their concerns with arrogant confidence. They are primitives, playing at being civilized, he said with contempt. They will not risk their lives for war trash. He was about to learn how wrong he was about humans. In her cell aboard Torvax's cruiser, Lyra heard guards talking about the growing response. She smiled, despite her fear and her injuries. You do not understand humans, she whispered to herself. They bond, and they protect, and they never abandon their own. Hope flickered in her heart, like a candle refusing to die. The fleet that gathered in the shadow of the asteroid belt was not impressive by galactic military standards. 12 cargo freighters, 4 mining vessels, 2 passenger transports, and 1 ancient warship held together by stubbornness and prayer. Against them stood Torvax's cruiser, with its military-grade weapons and trained soldiers. Any tactical computer would have calculated the odds and recommended immediate retreat. But humans did not fight according to tactical calculations. They fought according to their hearts. Marcus stood on the bridge of Sarah Chen's warship, watching the enemy cruiser on the view screen. This is suicide, Sarah said calmly, while running final checks on her weapon systems. You know that, right? Probably, Marcus agreed without looking away from the screen. You didn't have to come. Yes, I did, Sarah replied with a fierce smile. She's one of ours now. That means something. Ready through the communication channel. Miners and traders and haulers, who had never fired a weapon in anger, prepared to fight. They did it because a human asked for help, and because helping was what humans did. All ships, this is Marcus Cole, he broadcast across the fleet frequency. I won't lie to you about what we're facing today. That cruiser outguns us 10-1, and their soldiers are trained killers. He paused and took a deep breath. But they took someone who matters to me, someone who matters to all of us, and I'm not leaving without her. Then let's go get her, a gruff voice replied over the channel. The fleet surged forward into the most lopsided battle the sector had ever witnessed. Torvax watched the approaching ships with disbelief on his face. They're actually attacking, he said with shock breaking through his arrogance. Have they lost their minds completely? His tactical officer's fingers flew across the console. Targeting computer. Multiple contacts closing fast. They're not even trying to maintain formation. Destroy them, Torvax ordered with contempt. Show these primitives what happens when they challenge their betters. The cruiser opened fire, and the first human ship exploded in a ball of flame and debris. But the others kept coming, without slowing down at all. A mining vessel rammed itself into the cruiser's port weapons array and detonated its fuel reserves. 2 freighters coordinated their approach and used their cargo clamps to tear hull plating away. Someone started broadcasting old Earth music through every communication frequency to jam the enemy's coordination. The music was loud and chaotic and completely absurd in the middle of a battle. But somehow it worked, because Torvax's crew had never encountered anything like it before. What are they doing? The tactical officer screamed over the blaring guitars and drums. This makes no tactical sense. NP. They're being human, Torvax muttered with the first hint of fear creeping into his voice. Sarah Chen brought her warship alongside the cruiser and unleashed everything she had. Ancient weapons that should have been retired decades ago tore into the enemy hull. Boarding teams, go now, she shouted, while alarms blared throughout her shaking vessel. Marcus led 7 volunteers through the breach in the cruiser's hull. They were mechanics and traders, and 1 elderly cook who had insisted on coming. None of them had combat training, but all of them had weapons and determination. They fought their way through corridors filled with smoke and screaming alarms. 3 of his team fell in the first engagement, but the others pushed forward. Marcus took a pulse blast to his shoulder and kept moving without stopping. He had promised Lyra that she was his responsibility. He was not going to break that promise, no matter what it cost him. Torvax found him outside Lyra's cell, with blood covering half his face. "You're dying, human," the warlord said, while drawing his ceremonial blade. "All of this sacrifice for one piece of war trash." Marcus raised his weapon with his good arm and smiled. "I don't see war trash," he said with absolute conviction in his voice. "I see a princess. I see a survivor. I see someone worth dying for." He fired, but Torvax was faster and the blade cut deep into his side. Marcus fell against the cell door and fumbled with the release mechanism. "You will never understand why we do this," he gasped, while blood pooled beneath him. "That's why you'll lose." Torvax raised his blade for the killing blow, but stopped when light flooded the corridor. Lyra stood in the open doorway, with her freckles blazing like violet stars. She had heard everything through the door, and felt Marcus's determination through their bond. Her empathic strength surged as she stepped forward to confront the warlord. Abilities had grown stronger than ever during her captivity. Now she unleashed them in a wave of pure emotional truth. Every being on the ship felt what the conquered Velanti had felt during the war. They experienced the terror of children watching their parents die. They felt the grief of survivors burying their loved ones in mass graves. They lived through the despair of refugees starving on stations where no one cared. Torvax's own soldiers turned to look at their commander with horror in their eyes. They had followed orders without questioning what those orders really meant. Now they understood the true cost of their obedience. "What have we done?" one of them whispered while dropping his weapon. Torvax tried to rally his crew, but no one would listen anymore. His own second-in-command placed him under arrest for war crimes. The battle outside ended shortly after, when the cruiser's crew signaled surrender. Human ships remained functional, but all of them refused to celebrate. Too many had died for this to feel like victory. Lyra cradled Marcus in her arms, while medical teams rushed to save him. "You came for me," she whispered, with tears streaming down her face. "Always," Marcus managed to say, before unconsciousness claimed him. He spent 3 weeks in a medical bay, recovering from wounds that should have killed him. Lyra never left his side, except when the doctors physically removed her. When he finally woke, she was there holding his hand, with her freckles glowing softly. "The galaxy is talking about what happened," she told him quietly. "Torvax is in custody, and his crimes have been exposed to everyone." She paused and took a shaky breath. "Other Velanthi are organizing for the first time since the war. They want me to help lead them." Marcus squeezed her hand weakly. "You should do it," he said with pride warming his voice. "Your people need you," Lyra agreed while meeting his eyes. "But I'm not leaving you either. We're partners, remember?" She smiled, and it was like watching a sunrise after endless night. "My people need leaders, but first they need to see that survival is possible. You taught me that kindness exists even in the darkest places. Now I will teach them." 6 months later, the Second Chance flew again with its crew of 2. Lyra had become a symbol of hope for Velanthi refugees everywhere. She traveled between settlements, bringing news and coordinating relief efforts. But she always returned to the battered freighter and the human who had saved her. They sat together in the cockpit, watching stars streak past the viewport. Lyra was composing a new song that blended Velanthi harmonies with human rhythms. It told the story of 2 broken people who found each other against impossible odds. Marcus listened with a rare smile, softening his weathered face. "Not bad for war trash and a primitive," he said with gentle humor. Lyra laughed, and the sound was bright and free in ways it had not been for years. "Not bad at all," she agreed. She had lived on leftovers, forgotten by a galaxy that saw only what it wanted to see. He had looked at her and seen a princess, waiting to remember who she was. In that simple act of recognition, a human had reminded the galaxy what it had forgotten. That worth is not diminished by circumstance. That dignity survives in the darkest places. And that sometimes the most primitive species understand something the elder races never learned. Everyone deserves to be seen. And when humans see someone worth protecting, they will burn down the stars themselves to keep that person safe. That was the truth Lyra sang to the void as their ship flew toward the next horizon. And somewhere out there, other forgotten souls heard her song and dared to hope again.